Spring 1945, Camp Hearne, Texas. The early morning air carries the unmistakable aroma of bacon frying in enormous kitchen vats, coffee brewing in massive urns, and fresh bread coming from military ovens. For Anna Richter, a 26-year-old German Red Cross nurse who arrived at this American prisoner of war camp just 3 days earlier, the smell is almost incomprehensible. She stands in the barracks line with hundreds of other German women prisoners, their faces bearing the marks of malnutrition, war trauma, and psychological dislocation that comes from capture and imprisonment. The women whisper among themselves in hushed German voices, their conversations constrained by uncertainty and the fear that remains even in this strange camp surrounded by Texas plains rather than barbed wire fences. Anna remembers the journey across the Atlantic, the crowded transport ship, the fear that had gripped her throughout the voyage. She had heard the propaganda, absorbed the ideology about what Americans would do to German prisoners. She had seen newsreels depicting American brutality, and heard countless stories about the horrors awaiting anyone captured by American forces. She had prepared herself mentally for suffering, for degradation, for the worst treatment that enemies could inflict. Yet nothing in her preparation or psychological anticipation could have readied her for this moment when she first smells bacon and fresh coffee while standing in the prisoner line about to receive her breakfast. The story of German nurses in American prisoner of war camps during 1945 represents one of the most remarkable, yet overlooked chapters of World War II's conclusion. These women had served the German military in various nursing capacities throughout the war. Some had worked in field hospitals on the Eastern Front, providing medical care to German soldiers amid the brutal fighting against Soviet forces. Others had served in base hospitals across occupied Europe. Still others had worked in hospital ships or transport facilities. They represented diverse backgrounds, education levels, and levels of commitment to Nazi ideology. Some had been enthusiastic supporters of the regime. Others had been conscripted into service and harbored serious doubts about the Nazi system. Most had simply been doing their jobs as nurses, providing medical care to those who needed it without deep consideration of the larger ideological questions. Their capture had occurred in various circumstances as American forces advanced across Europe in the final months of the war. Some had been captured when American forces overran hospital facilities they were staffing. Others had been captured alongside military units they were attached to. A few had been arrested on suspicion of involvement in war crimes or intelligence operations. Their arrival in America had been traumatic. Many had believed they would be imprisoned indefinitely or executed. The propaganda they had absorbed made them expect systematic cruelty. Camp Hearne, located in Texas, was one of several American prisoner of war camps designed to house German prisoners captured in the European theater. The camp had been constructed with considerable American military resources and reflected American commitment to following Geneva Convention protocols regarding prisoner treatment. The camp commanders understood that they held hundreds of thousands of German prisoners who would eventually be repatriated. The commanders recognized that how these prisoners were treated would influence not merely immediate circumstances, but long-term relations between America and the defeated German nation. The camps were designed with separate facilities for officers, enlisted men and women. The women's sections were overseen by American military women, many of whom brought humanitarian values and professional nursing backgrounds to their supervisory roles. The decision regarding what meals to serve prisoners had been made at high levels of American military command. The general principle guiding prisoner treatment reflected Geneva Convention requirements that prisoners be fed adequate nutrition and that their food be prepared with consideration for their physical and psychological welfare. American military quartermaster divisions were tasked with providing nutritionally adequate meals to prisoners. The principle was that prisoners should receive the same rations that American troops received, modified only for dietary and cultural differences where appropriate. On that first morning at Camp Hearne, as Anna and the other German women stood in line, American military personnel served breakfast portions that seemed almost impossible in their abundance. Plates appeared containing fried bacon, scrambled eggs, fresh bread with butter, portions of fresh fruit when available, and cups of hot coffee with cream and sugar. For women who had lived under German rationing since 1939, who had experienced increasingly severe food shortages as the war progressed, who had in many cases gone hungry during the final months of the war as German society disintegrated, the meals appeared miraculous. Anna stared at her plate, uncertain whether this was a dream or hallucination brought on by malnutrition and stress. The other women around her reacted similarly. Some cried silently, others stood frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. One woman next to Anna whispered in awestruck German, "This cannot be real. They will take it back. They will make us watch while they throw it away." But the American personnel simply gestured for them to sit and eat. There was no trick, no psychological cruelty disguised as kindness. The American women who served the meals looked at the German women with expressions that suggested they expected gratitude, but also seemed to recognize the profound significance of the moment. The quality and quantity of food provided to German prisoners represented a profound contrast to the circumstances these women had left behind in Germany. Letters that German prisoners received from relatives still in occupied Germany described catastrophic food shortages, destroyed cities, populations facing starvation, and economic collapse. The contrast between the abundance that German prisoners experienced in American camps and the scarcity that their families faced created profound psychological complexity. How could they consume adequate meals while their mothers, sisters, and brothers suffered hunger in destroyed Germany? Some German women prisoners struggled with guilt associated with eating well, while receiving news of their family's deprivation. The guilt was compounded by the realization that their captors were providing the meals. How could they accept nourishment from enemies? How could they be grateful for food provided by Americans when Germans were suffering? The American military leadership recognized these psychological dynamics and understood that the provision of adequate food served purposes beyond mere physical nutrition. Adequate meals improved prisoner morale and health. They reduced disciplinary problems. They contributed to the general message that American treatment of prisoners reflected different values than Nazi treatment of prisoners had reflected. The kitchens at Camp Hearne were often staffed partially by German prisoners themselves, women who had cooking experience and who were assigned to assist American military cooks in food preparation. This created an interesting dynamic where German women prisoners participated in preparing the very meals they consumed. Some women found this role meaningful and empowering. They could ensure that food was prepared with understanding of German tastes and cultural preferences. They could communicate with other prisoners about the abundance and quality of the meals. They became informal ambassadors demonstrating that the American system treated prisoners as having dignity and capability rather than merely as objects to be controlled. Other German women struggled with the complexity of the situation. To work in the kitchen was to collaborate with the American system, to participate in the provision of meals that symbolized American values, to become complicit in the system of their captivity, even as they received its benefits. Anna Richter found herself assigned to kitchen duty within her first week at Camp Hearne. Her pre-war nursing training and her experience as a medical professional made her valuable to the American military personnel who supervised the camp. She was assigned to work under the supervision of an American military woman named Sergeant Margaret Sullivan, a professional nurse from Indiana, who had been trained in military nursing and who brought both competence and compassion to her role overseeing German prisoner welfare. Sullivan recognized in Anna the characteristics of a trained professional. She began assigning Anna responsibilities that recognized her nursing background while utilizing her in the kitchen environment where food preparation related to prisoner health and welfare. The two women formed a working relationship that gradually evolved into something more meaningful. Sullivan treated Anna not as a prisoner, but as a fellow professional in the healthcare field. She engaged Anna in conversations about nursing practice, about medical care, about the conditions the prisoners faced. She asked for Anna's professional insights regarding what would improve prisoner health and morale. This treatment was revolutionary for Anna, who had expected American contempt and systematic degradation. Instead, she encountered respect for her professional capabilities and recognition of her basic human worth. The food that German prisoners received at Camp Hearne reflected American abundance and American commitment to providing adequate nutrition. The typical breakfast included items that were luxuries in wartime Germany. Fresh eggs appeared regularly despite the fact that egg production in wartime Germany had been severely rationed and largely reserved for military personnel. Bacon appeared with regularity that would have been impossible in Germany, where meat rationing had become increasingly severe as the war progressed. Fresh bread baked daily in camp kitchens provided abundance that contrasted with the bread rationing system in Germany. Coffee with sugar and cream appeared regularly at meals despite the fact that coffee and sugar had been luxury items in Germany for years. Fresh vegetables and fruits appeared in meals when available, providing nutrition that German prisoners' bodies desperately needed after years of malnutrition. The meals were often prepared by German cooks working under American supervision, which meant that German prisoners could ensure that meals included familiar foods and preparation methods that reflected German culinary traditions while utilizing American abundance. The combination of familiar foods prepared in ways that German women recognized with American abundance created meals that nourished bodies while also providing psychological comfort through cultural familiarity. The impact of adequate nutrition on German prisoners' physical health was measurable and significant. Medical records from American camps documented consistent weight gain among prisoners, improvement in skin conditions and hair quality that had degraded during wartime malnutrition, and general improvement in physical health markers. For women who had experienced years of insufficient nutrition, particularly the severe shortages of the final war years, the provision of adequate meals represented something approaching healing. The physical transformation that occurred as German prisoners' bodies began to recover from malnutrition was visible and profound. Women who had arrived at camps with hollow cheeks and skeletal frames began to gain weight and recover physical health. Hair that had been dull and weak began to regain luster and strength. Skin conditions improved as bodies received adequate vitamins and nutrients. The physical recovery represented something beyond mere medical necessity. It represented renewal and restoration of the fundamental dignity that malnutrition had stolen from these women. To recover one's physical health and vitality represented a return to basic human functionality that wartime deprivation had taken away. The psychological impact of receiving abundant food from enemy hands created complex emotional responses among German prisoners. Many women struggled with cognitive dissonance between their expectations of American cruelty and the reality of American provision of meals. The propaganda they had absorbed created expectations that conflicted with observable reality. How could the American enemy be providing abundant meals and humane treatment? The explanation had to be either that the propaganda had lied about Americans or that the apparent kindness was manipulation designed to break prisoners' resistance psychologically. Some women resolved this cognitive dissonance by viewing American kindness as evidence of American weakness. Surely only weak nations could afford such generosity toward enemies. Surely Americans were so confident in their military victory that they could afford humanitarian treatment. Other women resolved the conflict by reconsidering the propaganda they had absorbed. If Americans were not the savage demons they had been told about, what else in the propaganda might have been false or exaggerated? This process of questioning propaganda and ideology was profound and uncomfortable for many women who had spent their entire lives within German ideological systems that demanded ideological conformity and discouraged critical questioning. The meals shared between American guards and German prisoners created spaces of unexpected connection and humanity. Sometimes American military women would join German prisoners during meals, sitting with them and eating the same food. These moments were significant beyond their surface appearance. They demonstrated equality in the most basic sense. American women sat across from German women, both eating the same meals, both engaging in the fundamental human activity of nourishing their bodies. The act of sharing meals transcended the framework of prisoner and guard. It created moments of recognition of shared humanity. Conversations occurred during these meals that went beyond prisoner-guard interactions into spaces where women talked about their families, their homes, their experiences during the war, their hopes and fears about the future. German women learned that American women had also experienced loss during the war. Some American women had lost sons, brothers, or husbands in combat. Some had experienced bombing raids on American targets or other direct impacts of the war. The sharing of these experiences created connection across the lines of military opposition. German women came to understand that their American captors were not the savage enemy that propaganda had depicted, but rather women who, like themselves, had been affected by the war and who chose to respond with compassion rather than cruelty. Sergeant Sullivan began inviting Anna to sit with her during meal breaks, conversations that became increasingly personal and meaningful. Sullivan shared her own experiences, including the loss of a friend whose husband had been killed during the war. She spoke about her motivations for pursuing nursing as a profession and her commitment to treating all patients with professional care and human respect regardless of their nationality or the political context of the war. Sullivan spoke about her concerns regarding how prisoners were sometimes treated in other camps where commanders were less committed to Geneva Convention protocols. She expressed her belief that how America treated German prisoners would influence long-term relations between the nations after the war ended. These conversations were educational for Anna. She encountered American perspectives on the war, on national identity, on what it meant to be professional, and on humanitarian values that transcended national boundaries. Sullivan encouraged Anna to speak about her own experiences, to share her perspective on nursing, to discuss what she had experienced during her service in German field hospitals. Anna found herself able to articulate perspectives that she had been unable to express in German society, where questioning or critical analysis of Nazi policies was dangerous. She described her concerns about medical practices she had witnessed, about ethical questions that had troubled her, about conflicts between medical ethics and the demands of Nazi ideology. The food that appeared on tables at Camp Hearne became a medium through which American values and abundance communicated themselves to German prisoners. Steak appeared regularly at evening meals, a luxury that most German prisoners had not consumed since before the war. The steaks were prepared with American skill and abundance that contrasted with German wartime meat rationing. Fresh vegetables appeared in variety and abundance. Fresh fruits appeared when available, including tropical fruits that had never been available in Germany. Desserts appeared regularly, including items made from sugar and butter and other ingredients that had been severely rationed or unavailable in wartime Germany. The abundance was not wasteful or deliberately excessive. Rather, it reflected the normal American provision of adequate nutrition. But compared to what German prisoners had experienced in recent years, it appeared almost miraculous. One German prisoner later described the meals as representing American abundance and American commitment to nutritional adequacy. She wrote in her memoir, "The steaks were not merely meat. They were evidence that an entire nation could feed its people adequately, while also providing abundance to prisoners of war. They were evidence of industrial capacity, agricultural productivity, and values that prioritized human welfare." The steaks represented the difference between systems. The provision of adequate meals to German prisoners occurred within a broader context of American commitment to following Geneva Convention protocols. American military leadership had received clear directives that prisoners were to be treated according to Geneva Convention requirements. The directives were based on both legal obligation and humanitarian principle. The Geneva Convention of 1929 established minimum standards for prisoner treatment, including adequate nutrition, medical care, humane treatment, and protection from abuse. American military commanders were instructed to follow these protocols. Violations of the protocols were investigated and could result in disciplinary action. The commitment to following protocols reflected American military values regarding the proper treatment of prisoners, and American confidence that adherence to humanitarian principles would contribute to long-term peace and reconciliation after the war ended. The provision of adequate meals to German prisoners represented one of the most visible manifestations of this commitment to humanitarian principles. Prisoners received identical rations to what American military personnel received, adjusted only for dietary and cultural differences. The message communicated by this policy was clear. Prisoners were human beings worthy of adequate nutrition and basic respect, regardless of their status as enemies or prisoners. The transformation of German prisoners' perspectives occurred gradually through accumulated experiences of American kindness and humane treatment. Breakfast meals followed by lunch followed by dinner, day after day, week after week, with abundant and adequate nutrition, changed how German prisoners understood their captors and their circumstances. The consistent provision of meals without cruelty, without punishment through hunger, without degradation communicated values and commitments that propaganda had taught them to doubt. Some German women prisoners began to question other propaganda they had absorbed. If Americans were not the savage enemy depicted, if Americans treated prisoners humanely and provided adequate food, what about other claims made in Nazi propaganda? What about the claimed American decadence and cultural inferiority? What about the claims regarding American political weakness and moral bankruptcy? If the propaganda had been wrong about American treatment of prisoners, might it have been wrong about other things? This process of questioning and reconsidering propaganda was uncomfortable and destabilizing for many women. But it was also liberating in ways that they had not anticipated. Anna Richter found herself becoming increasingly aware of the complexity of her situation as weeks passed at Camp Hearne. She was receiving abundant food from enemy hands. She was developing genuine friendship with an American woman who had been kind and respectful to her. She was being treated with professional respect based on her nursing training. She was beginning to question ideology that she had absorbed without questioning for most of her life. Yet she maintained loyalty to her nation and concern for her family members still suffering in occupied Germany. This combination of experiences created psychological tension that she struggled to resolve. She was grateful for American kindness while maintaining awareness that Americans were enemies of her nation. She respected Sergeant Sullivan while maintaining consciousness that they represented different nationalities and potentially conflicting national interests. She valued the intellectual freedom she experienced in conversations with Sullivan while feeling guilty about questioning German ideology. These tensions remained unresolved. Anna could not fully reconcile them, but the experience of living with these tensions, of holding multiple perspectives simultaneously, transformed her understanding of complexity and nuance in ways that her pre-capture experience had not prepared her for. The letters that German prisoners received from family members in Germany created additional complexity regarding food and abundance. Prisoners would receive letters describing starvation in occupied German cities, describing family members' desperation to find adequate food, describing the collapse of German society and economy. The German women prisoners would receive these letters and then sit down to meals of abundant steak and fresh vegetables. The contrast created moral complexity and psychological pain. Some women struggled with guilt about eating well while their families suffered. Some felt anger at the unfairness of the situation. Some responded by attempting to share their abundance with family members through packages sent back to Germany. American military authorities sometimes permitted prisoners to send food packages to their families through Red Cross channels. Some German prisoners prioritized sending portions of their rations back to their families, rather than consuming everything themselves. This represented profound sacrifice of their own recovery and health, in service of family loyalty and concern. The American military recognized the humanitarian value of permitting such packages, and often facilitated the process, despite the expense and logistical complexity involved. The role of American military women in administering prisoner care brought particular significance to the provision of meals and basic care. Many American military women who supervised prisoner facilities had themselves experienced discrimination and limitations based on their gender in American society. Some recognized parallels between their own experiences of constraint and limitation and the experiences of German women in a militaristic society that had severely restricted women's autonomy and roles. American military women sometimes used their positions to demonstrate alternative models of women's capability and authority. They supervised male guards, made decisions regarding prisoner treatment and facility management, and exercised authority based on their professional competence rather than male dominance. German women prisoners observed these American women in positions of authority and responsibility, exercising command and making decisions. This exposure to alternative models of women's roles and authority had profound impact on many German prisoners' perspectives regarding women's capabilities and roles in society. The image of American military women calmly managing complex prisoner operations, making decisions with confidence and competence, suggested possibilities for women's authority and capability that contrasted with German social models that had limited women's roles. The holiday meals provided at Camp Hearne represented particular significance in German prisoners' memories. Christmas dinner in American prisoner camps became legendary among German prisoners. The meals included turkey when available, dressing, vegetables, desserts, and other elements of American holiday tradition. The provision of special meals for religious holidays communicated respect for prisoners' religious identity and cultural traditions. American military leadership recognized that providing recognition of religious holidays contributed to prisoner morale and demonstrated respect for cultural and religious identity. The Christmas dinner meals were often served in an atmosphere that permitted some festive celebration within the constraints of the camp environment. German prisoners were permitted to sing Christmas carols and engage in other traditional holiday observances. American military personnel sometimes attended these celebrations. The combination of abundant food, religious and cultural recognition, and permissible celebration created moments that stood out in prisoners' memories. One German prisoner later described Christmas dinner in the American camp as the moment when she began to believe that peace and reconciliation might be possible after the war ended. The meal represented not merely food, but communication of values and recognition of shared humanity that transcended the framework of war and military opposition. The medical aspects of adequate nutrition for German prisoners extended beyond basic physical health into implications for psychological well-being and recovery from trauma. Malnutrition and starvation create psychological effects that extend beyond physical symptoms. Individuals suffering from severe malnutrition experience cognitive changes, emotional dysregulation, and psychological symptoms that parallel serious mental health conditions. The provision of adequate nutrition to malnourished German prisoners contributed to recovery not merely of physical health, but of psychological and emotional functioning. As German prisoners' nutritional status improved, they experienced improvements in mood, cognitive functioning, emotional regulation, and general psychological well-being. The process of recovery from malnutrition and trauma involved not merely provision of adequate meals, but psychological recovery facilitated by humane treatment, respect, and demonstrations of care. The American military recognized, at least implicitly, that prisoner welfare involved dimensions beyond physical nutrition. The provision of humane treatment, recognition of human dignity, and demonstrations of respect contributed to overall prisoner welfare in ways that extended beyond meeting minimum Geneva Convention requirements. The repatriation of German prisoners in late 1945 and early 1946 meant departure from the American camps that had provided abundance and humane treatment. As German prisoners prepared to return to Germany, many struggled with complex emotions about their departure. They had formed relationships with American military women who had supervised them and shown them kindness. They had experienced abundance and adequate nutrition that contrasted sharply with the deprivation they anticipated facing in occupied Germany. They had been exposed to American values, American culture, and American perspectives that had transformed their understanding in ways they were still processing. Some German women prisoners attempted to maintain contact with American friends they had made during their captivity. Letters were exchanged across the Atlantic during the immediate post-war years. Some relationships endured for decades as former prisoners and former guards maintained correspondence and occasionally visited one another. Other relationships faded with the passage of time and the demands of reconstruction and reintegration into German society. But the memories of American kindness and adequate meals remained vivid and influential for many German women who had experienced American prisoner treatment. Anna Richter returned to Germany in early 1946, after approximately 10 months in American captivity. She carried with her memories of adequate meals, of Sergeant Sullivan's kindness and respect, of American abundance, and of the perspectives she had developed regarding American values and American society. She also carried physical recovery from malnutrition. Her body had regained weight and health during her months in the American camp. She had regained physical strength and capability that malnutrition had stolen from her. She brought these physical and psychological transformations back to Germany, where she found a devastated nation, struggling with the immediate aftermath of war and beginning the long process of reconstruction and recovery. Anna found employment as a nurse in post-war Germany, using her nursing training to contribute to the recovery and reconstruction effort. She occasionally spoke about her experiences in American captivity, describing the humane treatment, the abundance of food, and the American values that her experiences had exposed her to. Her testimony contributed to German understanding of America that transcended wartime propaganda and military enmity. Her words suggested that reconciliation and understanding between America and Germany might be possible despite the bitterness of war. The story of German nurses and adequate meals in American prisoner camps represented a profound human investment in reconciliation and peace-building. The decision by American military leadership to provide adequate nutrition to German prisoners, following Geneva Convention protocols even when international law did not require absolute compliance, reflected values regarding human dignity and long-term vision for post-war relations. The provision of adequate meals communicated values that transcended the immediate circumstances of war and captivity. It communicated respect for human dignity. It communicated confidence that humane treatment would contribute to long-term peace, rather than fueling resentment and revenge. It communicated American values regarding the proper treatment of enemies and prisoners of war. The impact of these meals and this treatment extended far beyond the immediate physical nourishment of individual prisoners. The meals and the humane treatment they represented contributed to German perspectives regarding American values that influenced long-term attitudes toward America and Americans during the Cold War period and beyond. German women who had experienced American kindness during their captivity communicated these experiences to their families, communities, and nations. Their testimonies contributed to reconciliation and understanding that would prove essential for the reconstruction of Europe and the development of lasting peace between America and Germany. The meals shared between German prisoners and American personnel, the abundance of food provided to former enemies, the consistent demonstrations of respect for human dignity across lines of military opposition represented profound investments in peace and reconciliation. These simple acts of providing adequate nutrition and demonstrating respect for human dignity communicated more effectively than any political negotiations or diplomatic statements about American values and American vision for post-war relations. The German nurses and other prisoners who experienced American kindness and adequate meals became ambassadors for reconciliation. When they returned to Germany, they carried memories of American abundance and American respect that could shape German attitudes toward America in ways that contributed to the recovery and reconstruction of Europe and to the development of the Atlantic alliance that would define the Cold War era and beyond. The meals provided to German prisoners in American camps represented one of the truest investments in peace and long-term reconciliation that could have been made during the immediate aftermath of World War II.